Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Is that working? Yeah, okay. Today we're going to study the subject of narcissism, both psychopathology and treatment. I'll try to bring you an overview of the studies and developments about the subject of narcissism in our Institute for Personality Disorders. And to start out with, I thought I should introduce you to the members of the Institute. What I'm presenting to you is not simply my thinking, but the product of work of a group of an Institute for Personality Disorders that has been active for the last 30 years at the Cornell University Medical School. And you may know the names of some of the people who are quite well known internationally. Michael Stone is our expert on forensic psychiatry. Diana Diamond, our expert on attachment and early development. Mark Lenzenberger is an epidemiologist. He's the one who discovered that there's a genetic predisposition to schizotypal personality, but not to schizoid personality, which is important. Armand Loranger developed the test for personality disorders for the World Health Organization, and Lena Normadin directs studies on child and adolescents, particularly trauma in child and adolescents in Quebec, and Kenneth Levy is an important researcher in the field of psychotherapy and expert in research project developments. Yves Caligore, whom you probably have heard less from, is one of our most important clinical psychoanalysts and theoreticians. Kay Heron is my wife, who is sitting there in the corner. We have been, and she's a specialist in transference-focused psychotherapy, one of our senior teachers and supervisors. We have published the manual on transference-focused psychotherapy, 3rd edition, about a year ago, and towards the end of this year, 3 publications will come out. A book on narcissism, the first editor of which will be Diana Diamond, and which will contain much of the material that I'm going to summarize to you today. There will be a general text about psychoanalytic psychotherapy for all personality disorders, of which the main author is Yves Caligore, which I believe is going to be a classic. And there's a book of my own coming out, selection of recent papers on personality disorders, narcissism, and erotic transference and countertransference. So I have mentioned to you, I think, the people who have been most involved in the narcissism work that I'm going to present to you now. What is narcissism? It can be defined at a clinical level and a theoretical level within psychoanalytic theory. At a clinical level, narcissism is an essential and normal part of the personality. We all hopefully have an adequate doses of normal narcissism, which means, first of all, the experience of an integrated self experience of continuity between our past, present, and how we project ourselves into the future, and continuity about the different ways in which we are under different circumstances. It is the source of self-esteem, self-regard, of pleasurable self-affirmation, and in short, pleasure in living. This experience is based, as I said, on an integrated concept of self, as we yesterday started in some detail. But it is supported by other psychic structures. First of all, it is supported by an integrated system of values, our own superego, the fact that we live up to what we consider the ideal way in which we should be, being in harmony with ourselves, with our conscience. Second, it is strongly supported by the internal world of significant others that we have built up over the years. The total of integrated representation of the people who are close to us, whom we love and who love us, and who give us a sense of sharing a world with friends and people whom we love and with mutual understanding, and to support us and support our self-regard, our good feelings about ourselves. And third, by the fact that we are effective in dealing with the environment, that we are effective in the major area of work and profession, love and sex, social life, creativity, and in the process gratify our basic needs in terms of self-affirmation, a sublimated form of aggression, in our gratification of our sexual needs in the form of sexual love, gratification of our attachment needs in terms of closeness, and our needs for play bonding in terms of friendship and enjoyable interactions with our world of close friends. So that all these psychological structures support the normal sense of pleasurable self-affirmation and self-regard. From a theoretical viewpoint, Freud originated the concept of narcissism conceived as the libidinal investment of the self. For Freud, narcissism was the expression of libido directed to ourself, in contrast to libido invested in significant others, object love. So the destiny of libido is to be doubly invested in self and in others. This concept remained unchanged over many, many years, and only in the last 15 years was challenged theoretically by André Green, leading French psychoanalyst, who reminded us that in the constitution of a normal self, as the integration of idealized and persecutory segments of experience, it means integration of both love and hatred, libido and aggression, So Andre Green suggested that narcissism constitutes the combined investment of libidinal and aggressive impulses, hopefully under ordinary circumstances with a strong predominance of the libidinal investment of the self, pleasure in self-affirmation, rather a dominance of aggressive impulses in which our well-being depends mostly on the expression of aggression directed against others and ourselves. It is an important theoretical shift in psychoanalytic thinking, and of course it has very important meaningful practical consequences in the pathology of narcissism. What is pathological narcissism? The term narcissism used to be utilized for a number of concepts in older psychoanalytic literature. All this is gone by. And now we think about narcissism only at two levels of most general level of psychopathology. One, a non-specific one, namely the getting fixated at a level of infantile narcissism. In other words, the infantile sources of well-being that were normal during infancy and adolescence, but are no longer normal for an adult with the development of adult values. And it turns out that in all neurotic developments, in all personality disorders and all symptoms that derive from unconscious intrapsychic conflict, at the same time with getting fixated at the childhood conflict, one gets fixated at the childhood determinants of self-esteem. So a tendency of emotional immaturity and simplicity of values, somewhat childlike behavior in areas of conflicts, one's self-esteem being determined by childlike values of looking good, having many things, being centered on one's own pleasure in a childlike way. That's common broadly to all kinds of psychopathology and has clinically no particular relevance except giving this element of emotional immaturity common to many types of pathology. And then there is a specific severe personality disorder, the narcissistic personality disorder, in which the entire pathology centers around abnormality of self-experience, self-esteem, self-regard. Narcissism is severely distorted. Paradoxically, the narcissistic personality disorder was never discovered by Freud. It's the only aspect, and very important clinical aspect, of narcissism that derived from his findings but was carried out by a number of other authors. I won't go through the history of the work of Carl Abraham and then Brierly and Melanie Klein and Rune Berger, etc., etc., etc. In the last 20 years of the past century, three major approaches to narcissism developed. One was originated by Melanie Klein in her book on envy and gratitude, one of the most important clinical studies of pathological narcissism, on the basis of which Herbert Rosenfeld developed his more specific description of the narcissistic personality. That was one line, and Heinz Kohut in the United States developed another theoretical line, and myself, also in the United States, developed the concept based in part on the Kleinian line of thinking that, as you may have already noticed, has influences profoundly my own theoretical stance, and the ego-psychological development of the concept, Annie Reich, and particularly the work of Margaret Mahler and Edith Jacobson. I may be considered the disciple of Edith Jacobson in a way, and I tried to synthesize the ego-psychological and the Kleinian approaches, and at the same time develop empirically the study, the clinical study of these personalities. So I think that in our institute we are really, I hope I'm not exaggerating this, that we are the leading institution studying all the dimension of narcissism that really were not carried out on the basis of their other orientation. I should also mention a French orientation based on Rune and others, but that has not developed into the study of the specific narcissistic personality disorders. So I'm going to give you an overview of where we are now. You know the background. I'm going to describe the clinical aspects of the narcissistic personality disorder, the descriptive features, then talk about the structural aspects of the personality, in other words, the underlying deeper psychological structures reflected in all the symptoms that I will mention. Then about the dominant unconscious conflicts, the dynamics of those cases, and then describe to you the clinical syndromes, because the narcissistic personality disorder shows in many different ways that have important diagnostic and therapeutic implications. Descriptive features. The most important one is the presence of what we call the pathological grandiose self. The pathological grandiose self is a kind of an hypertrophic, exaggerated, abnormal sense of self, characterized clinically by self-centeredness and entitlement, an over-dependency on admiration, a dominance of fantasies of success and grandiosity, an inordinate ambitiousness, very often an ambitiousness that exceeds the capabilities, the realistic capabilities of the individual, a studious avoidance of realities that are contrary to that fantasies of success and grandiosity, and strangely enough, from time to time, bouts of intense insecurity when that pathological grandiose self collapses and leaves the individual with a tremendous sense of inferiority, insecurity, helplessness, extremely painful, devastating state from which they try to escape as fast as possible to recreate the usual sense of assuring grandiosity. That's the pathological grandiose self. Second, these patients are characterized by an inordinate amount of envy and dismissive behavior toward others. Let me say a few words about envy. Envy is a complex, normal affect that all of us, I imagine, have experienced. It is a derivative form of aggression, ultimately derived from the fight-flight affective system, and from its development, not only as intense rage, but the structuralization of rage into hatred. Hatred is a structural derivative of rage. It's a permanent, intense wish to destroy what is seen as dangerous or painful or threatening. So hatred is a stable, internalized object relation between self and a hated object, and of course with the corresponding fears that others, people hatred, may destroy one. The difference between hatred and envy is that in hatred you try to destroy what is bad and dangerous and threatening. Envy is a specialized form of hatred that is directed not against the bad object, but against something good that we want to have and that is being withheld, that we can't get. So that hatred is directed against something that at the bottom we love, but because we can't have it, we need to destroy, to eliminate the painful feeling that we can't have what we want. In discrete form, it is a normal a normal affect without any major dangerous consequences. But in these cases, it is very intense, and it is really a permanent motivational affect that is extremely dangerous because it's directed against what is good. So one destroys potential sources of gratification because one doesn't have them, and with this, in effect, one creates self-defeating deprivation. So these patients suffer under constant, intense envy. And to give you a clinical example, simple example, I have a patient, a physician with a narcissistic personality disorder, who in his specialty is in a university setting. He goes to professional meetings and he's got, who has more to contribute, who knows more. He can't, in the discussions, he can't listen and learn from what's discussed about the subject because he's so concerned whether he has most knowledge, he has the best ideas, that there is no possibility of acquiring anything. And he suffers terribly because he has to be sure that he's the best. If he's not the best, it creates an intolerable situation. And the people who have something to say that he recognizes, by gosh, this person knows more than I, instead of being able to listen and learn or be grateful for the learns, has to eliminate, erase what gets. When my patient goes to a conference, very often with the sense, let's see what this guy is going to tell us, with an attitude of depreciation that gives him a sense of security, and he listens attentively and dismantles what he hears. But if he hears something really valuable, envy takes over. He thinks, how could this man know this? Where did he learn that? How old is he? Did I did the same at his age or not? And is unable to hear anything. So learning suffers terribly. You can see that from childhood on. One of my patients, the youngest of a series of boys, the older brothers were excellent skiers, and so they took him along, and he started to learn to ski. About 5-6 years of age, but he realized all the older brothers did much better than he. He got into such a rage that he didn't want to ski. That I don't like ski. I'm not a skier. No, this is not in. And he never learned to ski in a family that lived in a mountainous region where everybody practically was using. Well, I don't need to tell you people. So you see the devastating effect. Students, a typical adolescent with narcissistic personality disorder has a strange school record. In some subject, he's the best, was always the best, will always be the best, studies and works hard because he feels he's the best, everything, he learns everything to keep. Another subject fails totally because there are others who are doing better, so he drops them. So it's an irregularity of the school record which is quite typical. I think I've given you enough examples of the destructive force of envy. And it is not only conscious, but it's unconscious. Very often behind the conscious devaluation and dismissing people, ideas, things, is unconscious envy. And in the treatment, one has to get that out, and it makes the patients suffer even more envy in the early stages of treatment, so it makes real changing treatment a very painful experience. These patients show intense greediness and exploitiveness, devaluation of others, as I already explained, a typical incapacity to depend. They cannot depend on anybody because to depend means to acknowledge the value of the person on whom you depend, whom you need. And that runs against their need to be self-sufficient, superior, and to be in a dependent position means to be inferior regarding the other person. All relationships become immediately one between one who is superior and one who is inferior, and if the patients are not superior, it is an intolerable situation, and to depend puts them into this intolerable situation. And that incapacity to depend is a main issue in the psychoanalytic and psychotherapeutic treatment of these patients. And it is noticed immediately by the therapist in that one has the strange sense, rather than having a patient, one has a competing colleague or somebody who carefully evaluates everything he gets from the therapist, if it's good enough or not. The patient becomes the supervisor of the therapist, and it's an expression of the incapacity to depend. And it's a major source of what has to be interpreted. They show a lack of empathy with others, which is dramatic. These are sometimes very intelligent, sensitive, educated people who have an incapacity to put themselves into the feelings of others, which is a consequence of the destruction of their internal world of object relation. So lack of empathy, shallowness of feelings, incapacity to commit themselves because commitment is already a type of dependency. They have difficulty to commit themselves to a love object, great difficulty to establishing stable love relations, difficult to commit themselves to work or profession, very often with the fear, if I do that, I will miss out on that. What should I be? Should I take this profession or that, this work or that? There's always a feeling there are others that are better, and if they commit themselves to one thing, they are missing out on what they could still put them in a superior spot. And so their own grandiosity is more important than the investment in the normal sense of pleasure of investment in a profession, in an art, in a work. They present a typical form of negative therapeutic reaction. I don't think we talked about negative therapeutic reaction yesterday. So let me say that negative therapeutic reaction is an important complicating development in psychoanalytic psychotherapies. It's not negative transference, but it is worsening when the patient feels that he has been helped. It's a paradoxical reaction in which the patient feels worse right after having acknowledged that the therapist has been helpful to him. And this reaction, which if one is not used to it at first, comes as a surprise to the therapist, has three major sources. There are three types of negative therapeutic reaction. First, negative therapeutic reaction out of unconscious guilt, typical for depressive masochistic personalities who have an attitude as if they don't deserve to be happy, they don't deserve to receive everything without paying a price. Unconscious guilt is a dominant psychodynamic of the depressive masochistic personality, not the narcissistic, the depressive masochistic personality. And one patient of mine with this personality, as she was getting better, she said, I think I should stop the treatment. My sister needs help more than I think, why don't you take her in psychotherapy at this point? I'll be glad to stop. Nice illustration of the mechanism. Second form of negative therapeutic reaction out of unconscious envy. That's the one that narcissistic personalities show, and it's the most frequent source of negative therapeutic reaction that we find clinically. That's the real major source of negative therapeutic reaction. They get worse. I have a patient who session after session says, this treatment is good for nothing, well, this treatment is useless, I don't know why I'm coming, you're giving me just cliches, I know all this, I've read it. So in one session we got to a real acute, deep problem of which the patient became aware, and there was a sense, I never thought of that before. It is true that this is what happens in the relation with my wife. He's getting irritated at his wife just when she seemed particularly beautiful and attractive, and he would get irritated. You can see the pathology of envy. He understood, and that irritation, which seemed to him kind of constitutional, became a psychologically significant issue. So I was impressed. He came to the next session. I wondered, now, are we going on? And he started out, oh, again, this treatment that leads to nothing. So one funder said, do you remember our last session? He said, what about it? Do you remember anything? Barely. His reaction was clearly, immediately getting worse. Another patient of mine saw a book in a foreign language. And
is it possible to increase the level of the volume?
The level of...
Yeah.
So I have to have this very close. Okay, point out to me. Patient saw a book in a foreign language. He started resentfully thinking that I knew a foreign language, and immediately the effect was getting worse because the reaction was, oh, I must know more than he about the kind of things we were talking about. So all these are examples, and of course, as you study patients getting worse and what triggers it, regularly you find the dynamic of unconscious envy. The third type of negative therapeutic reaction is an extremely severe one, only in the most severe personality disorders, and these are patients who have been traumatized, chronically abused, severely abused and traumatized, and had almost no source of love or understanding, and operate under the assumption that the only way in which anybody is interested in them is if they start a fight. Only in the middle of aggressive interaction is there any real interest, and they transform the treatment in a battlefield and destroy everything that they receive as part of maintaining chronic warfare at the cost of self-destruction. So it is they are extremely primitive sadomasochistic transferences that at times are impossible to overcome in extremely traumatized patients, and forced to shift the treatment into a supportive category. They cannot tolerate any deeper analytic approach that examines their emotional life. And finally, these patients show a degree of fragile idealization, which means that they have people or things that they admire, something fantastic that they want to have. So that idealization is like a preliminary step to incorporate something, or to incorporate it, that runs counter the unconscious envy of what they admire. So it decomposes and disappears. One finds this in the sexual promiscuity of narcissistic patients. One woman fell in love with famous who worked in the world of television and film, and she fell in love with attractive male actors, intense love, managed to get involved, seduce them, had a relationship. After a few weeks or few months, she got totally bored with these men, didn't know why she had selected them, dropped them, and went on to the next. You find this in both men and women, of course. By the way, let me say that it used to be thought that sexual promiscuity was a symptom of male narcissism, but not of male narcissistic personality disorder, not of female. But that was a mistake. It was a product of a patriarchal culture that powerfully militated against tolerating women's sexual promiscuity while fostering a socially perfectly appropriate male sexual promiscuity. With women's liberation, women's becoming independent and not dependent on male power to the extent that males' dominance was assured, have developed clearly that same sexual promiscuity that we find in men. Another important feature of the narcissistic personality is deficient value systems, superego pathology. Together with the pathological grandiose self, there is a weakening of one's internalized ideal assumptions, moral, ethical assumptions, and the higher functions that are controlled by the superego, the capacity for mature types of mourning, and a typical symptom is the incapacity to mourn. Very often the closest relative of these patients die and they have no mourning reaction at all. This shows also in the treatment, in that patients in analysis, the analyst goes away on an extended vacation. Analyst may be away for 2 months and comes back. Patient has the first session after 2-month absence and starts out saying, well, as I told you in our last session, they go on, there is no sense of discontinuity, and during all those 2 months they never thought about the analyst. Out of sight, out of mind. They suffer from severe mood swings instead of subtle feelings of sadness, of a kind of melancholic mood that all of us have from time to time for whatever reason. They don't experience that, but whenever there is a source of really unhappiness with self or self-criticism they cannot avoid, a severe, sudden, depressive mood starting suddenly, ended suddenly, and going into its opposite. They typically present what sociologists have called the shame culture rather than a guilt culture. In simple terms, they don't behave antisocially because they are afraid of being caught and put to shame, not because of a sense of guilt. They don't steal because they would feel guilty doing that, such as all other patients without superego pathology, but because they would be put to shame, and they are tempted to carry out antisocial behavior when they feel 100% safe and that nothing is going to stop that. It's of course, as you know, a frequent phenomenon in industry, and sometimes leads to scandals in persons who otherwise seem perfectly moral in their usual behavior. Their value systems are childlike. In other words, they show the strange thing is this being so grandiose. They are in a way which is still determined by infantile values. A 5-year-old will be loved if he or she is clean, will think fantastic if he has a collection of great toys, if all the friends admire the toys he has and he shows his toys, and so to be admired for one's appearance, one's cleanliness, how nice one looks, how it's a normal manifestation of narcissistic development in children, can go hand in hand with capacity for object relation in depth. Here it becomes a noticeable characteristic. These are the patients who have to look shiny, have the best suits, the best way to presenting themselves. If they are part of a social undergroup that demonstrates by dressing in provocative ways, coloring their hairs in provocative ways, they have to be those who do it the most within that particular culture. From the outside, sometimes they look the most absurd. But in educated, high-level patients, the attention to their physical appearance, the interest in having them most dramatically shining, impressive cars, to illustrate by whatever means they can what is envied in their physical presentation and in their belonging is accentuated. And are you indicating? Hello?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, I can't see you. Yes, now I can. What is?
I
Yes.
was just wondering if you would elaborate a little more on the difference between shame and guilt.
Just a second. Let me. Get my notes. So, can you repeat your question, please?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on the difference between shame and guilt. I find it such an interesting but very hard to grasp difference.
Shame is a painful feeling of being caught in a position of inferiority that degrades and inferiorizes one. Shame is an interpersonal experience. It indicates that one has shown something that one wouldn't want anybody to see because others will think that's terrible. Guilt, on the other hand, is an intrapsychic affect. It is having not lived up to one's own expectation or acted against one's own conviction. So it is a feeling of worthlessness that derives from one's own internal consciousness. Shame is a primitive early affect which gradually gets transformed into guilt. I mean, little baby soils a little child soils itself, and as long as nobody discovers it, it's okay. The mother says, "Shame on you." Baby is ashamed. An adult who uses control under circumstances where she should be in control, even if there's nobody watching, feels very bad about himself. That's not shame. That is a feeling of guilt of not living up to their own standards. Does that clarify?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So, when the sociologists consider our normal functioning to be regulated by one's own conscience, the normal culture is a guilt culture. And a shame culture is one in which everybody can get away with it as long as it's not caught. It has a more primitive regressive quality. And that's, of course, at the sociological level is social critique. Yes?
Are you going to say anything more about how to work with this dynamic when patient, like for example, I have a patient who finds it very difficult if I say something that he hasn't thought about before,
sure, yeah.
who often says, oh, I knew you would say that, I knew you would think like that, and he finds it very difficult when suddenly something new comes and
we are talking about psychopathology now. We'll go into treatment after. I'm separating that out. The incapacity to mourn, the severe mood swings, shame predominating over guilt, childlike values, these are the typical manifestations of deficient value systems. Now, there are three more that are very important. One, the development of habitual antisocial behavior, which is a consequence of more severe destruction of an internalized system of value, a kind of superego deficit. Habitual antisocial behavior that can be, we classified antisocial behavior into passive parasitic and aggressive. Passive parasitic is, all antisocial behavior is really an aggression against others and against society. Passive parasitic antisocial behavior consists in exploitive, extractive behavior, lying, stealing, writing false checks, irresponsibility with money. Aggressive behavior is frankly destructive behavior, attack on people, verbal or physical, attack on property, destructive behavior toward property as well as people. So these patients show habitual antisocial, some narcissistic patients show habitual antisocial behavior, and combined with it also an egosyntonic aggression. In other words, their self-esteem doesn't depend only on being nice and good and correct, but their self-esteem also gets increased by a sense of power and being able to express their sense of power and superiority by attacking or by exploiting. And third, they show a paranoid attitude of hyper-alertness to attacks from others, suspiciousness, hypersensitivity. So these are really manifestations of severe superego deficit. The combination, yesterday one of you asked me what's the difference between narcissism and malignant narcissism. I don't know, sitting over there. But in any case, now you are getting the answer. The combination of narcissistic personality, egosyntonic aggression, antisocial behavior, and paranoid orientation, those four features together determine the syndrome of malignant narcissism, which is the most severe form of the narcissistic personality, other than the antisocial personality proper, which is a chapter apart. So malignant narcissism is a syndrome of severity, a specific syndrome of severity of the narcissistic personality disorder. What I'm saying is that not all extremely severely ill narcissistic personalities show the syndrome of malignant narcissism. It's only a subgroup who shows that specific syndrome. But those are the most difficult to treat patients. It's important to make the diagnosis. And what is even more interesting is that this combination of narcissism, paranoid attitude, egocentric aggression, antisocial behavior occurs at very different levels of behavioral limitation or regression. The most severe patients who show that look like borderline personality, like ordinary borderline personality disorder, because they have a total breakdown in their social functioning, incapacity to work, incapacity of any relation, incapacity for any social work, a severe emotional dysregulation, practical breakdown, the incapacity for ordinary living, severe anxiety, depression as accompanying symptoms. So very often these are misdiagnosed as borderline personality disorders, hospitalized with that diagnosis, and one misses that specific syndrome, which is much more severe than the ordinary borderline patient. On the other hand, there are some narcissistic personalities whose pathological grandiose self is sufficiently strong and powerful in making them capable of functioning in ordinary social life, that on the surface they don't show to be that ill, except they are individuals with the unusual nature of extreme grandiosity, extreme aggression, extreme antisocial features, and extreme paranoid orientation. We find such persons very often in leadership positions of organization or political systems, particularly at times when there are natural sharp divisions in the social body between social in-group and out-group and political ideologies or parties that reflect that in their ideological formation. And they, under such turbulent situations, they become the leader of an extreme group that asserts its superiority, the need to fight its enemies. They lead the group, taking on a function of direction of the group toward triumph, and exploiting the paranoid nature of the ideology, showing an extremely aggressive behavior and total absence of any guilt feelings regarding the attack of the enemy. So the search for the security of triumph, the security of the attack on the enemy, the suspicion of the danger of the enemy, and the ruthlessness and total abandonment of moral constraints make them ideal leader for such a regressed social situation. So they become very dangerous leaders of institutions, school systems, hospital systems, political parties, or nations. And so we have, these don't become ordinary dictators, but they tend to establish totalitarian systems. They have to be loved and feared at the same time, not just loved. They are just not narcissists who have to be admired and they are happy. They have to be happy because they are superior and the follower have to be afraid of them. We have evidence that the personality of Stalin and of Hitler were presented these four features. I don't have time to give you more evidence at this point, but there are other historical dictators who didn't have those characteristics at all. Mussolini had a narcissistic personality, but not the syndrome of malignant narcissism, same as General Franco in Spain. And of course, to these days, we have such leaders all over the world. Idi Amin, nice illustration in Africa, and so on. And we don't have to look very far to find day-to-day examples of that. So at best, these can become very powerful and dangerous leaders of institutions. Just as a note of interest, I did some research years ago about the effect of this kind of leadership on hospital systems. I've been medical director of hospitals over 20 years, and I had the chance of observing many other directors of many hospitals to test the hypothesis that I established, that when such a person becomes the leader of the institution, immediately the institution gets organized into 3 levels of staff. Around the leader, there is immediate contour of individuals with antisocial features who can adapt perfectly to making the leader feel loved, manipulate the leader, and at the same time know that they have to be subservient. So these are the dishonest courtiers around the leader. Then the second layer, the big numbers of the institutional staff develop strong paranoid features because there is aggression coming from the top and one never knows when it will hit one, so one better be cautious. The morale of the institution deteriorates into a paranoid stance. And at the bottom, the individuals who develop depressive features and feel marginated, critical, depressed about the nature of the institution and tend to marginalize themselves and leave. That's the general hypothesis. And I even had demonstration of it in my own hospital. After I stepped down, after finishing my term as medical director, somebody was appointed medical director with these characteristics. 3 years later, he was surrounded by 2 or 3 totally dishonest people who were thrown out eventually because they were caught. There was a paranoid atmosphere which was very destructive, and the best people went out on the periphery. So it was an unwanted demonstration of a hypothesis. All of this to indicate the complexity of narcissistic pathology, in which such a severe condition can show up as severely hospitalized patient, or when the pathological brand yourself is sufficiently well put together, end up in such positions. Let me just finally add to this that, of course, in the political process, that requires a sociological situation in which there is the crystallization of a social group that feels isolated, frustrated, with chronic dissatisfactions or fears driving it into extreme, and therefore then becomes consolidated as no longer as a huge number of people, but as people who are joined by the very crystallization of the leader or an ideology or the combination, and who then feel the experience of mass psychology that Freud originally described in the 1920s. The fact that when individuals are part of an anonymous group that gets consolidated as a harmonious mass, one's thought process gets reduced, one's intelligence gets reduced, and one can only understand as part of that mass very simple messages, and develops the kind of resentment of complexity that is signaled by high individualization. So it's an anti-individualization aspect, a tendency of submission to the leader, a tendency of liberation by being part, and power by being part of a mass, and a sense of freedom from moral constraints. Everything is permitted because the leader carries the consciousness of the group. One projects one's morality into the leader. General immorality is tolerated. You have there the violence of masses, such as the Red Guards during Mao Zedong's times, the Shining Path in Peru, etc. So there is a correspondence between social conditions that produce mass movements and the ascents of leadership with malignant narcissism. Somebody was going to raise a question. No,
it was just
okay. Now, let's make use of this opportunity to discuss about the differential diagnosis of antisocial behavior. The importance of this differential diagnosis clinically is that it has immediate prognostic and therapeutic relevance. So I'm going to give you, I don't have this on this slide. So bear with me as I give you a list that you won't find on the slide. I'm going to go from the most extreme, severe, and dangerous aspect of antisocial behavior to the mildest one, normality. First, most severe, very rare, only those of you who work in the forensic system will ever have contact with that. It is the syndrome of pseudo-psychopathic schizophrenia. These are chronically schizophrenic patients with extremely dangerous, aggressive behavior, bizarre forms of murder, and when you treat these patients with medication, you can normalize the psychosis, but they continue functioning like an antisocial personality. You don't know what's preferable. They need chronic hospitalization with medication. They look pretty normal as they are in institutions for life, but you let them out on the street and they'll commit mayhem. So this is the most severe form that you probably won't see. By the way, It was discovered and described 1954 by Guttmacher in the United States, but usually it's not in the texts. It's amazing how we gain knowledge and we lose knowledge at the same time. Second category. The most important and frequent and dangerous in ordinary clinic, the antisocial personality disorder. The antisocial personality disorder is the most severe personality disorder that has zero treatment of any kind that we know. It is badly described in the official psychiatry texts. The best descriptions are those of the researchers in the field. Michael Stone is one of them. Hare has been, probably you know most, H-A-R-E, has described the antisocial personality device, important instruments. So Robert Hare's description and Michael Stone's description and my own, if you want to, delimit clearly that syndrome, the antisocial personality proper, that is also goes under the name of the psychopath, although some authors prefer to call psychopath only those antisocial personalities whose behavior is the most dangerous, who are mass murderers, sexual murderers, serial murderers of any kind. What characterizes the antisocial personality disorder is full developments of the entire narcissistic pathology, or let's say 90% of them show typical narcissistic pathology. 10% show a schizoid, paranoid, introverted personality. These are rare cases, usually very schizoid, isolated, and all of a sudden they jump out with violent, aggressive, and destructive behavior. These patients, so they show both their passive, parasitic, as well as aggressive, antisocial behavior, chronic from childhood on. Total lack of capacity for guilt feelings or concern. Total love of any investment in any value system. Total lack of investment in any relationships with significant others. An incapacity to project themselves into the future. They live into the eternal presence. Incapacity to learn from experience. A callousness that is frightening, but in many cases, particularly those with passive, parasitic antisocial behavior, can be hidden behind the charming exterior. And classically, they have been described as presenting a charming exterior, but that's only true for some of them. That's the antisocial personality proper. The diagnosis cannot be made in one or two interviews. It has to be made studying the entire history, observing these patients throughout time, studying them with third sources. Their total incapacity for investment shows they don't have friends, they don't have anybody with an exception. If they have pets, they can let the pet die without caring about it at all. That's the antisocial personality proper. It is whenever you have patients, I'm leaving that first group about pseudo-psychopathic schizophrenia out, clinically you have to differentiate them from all the others because all the rest are treatable. The next category is that of the syndrome of malignant narcissism that you already know. The next category is that of narcissistic personalities who show antisocial behavior, but they don't show the paranoid orientation nor the inordinate aggressivity. So they have a narcissistic personality with antisocial behavior, but without the intense aggression, without the paranoid features. These, I'll give you a simple example. I had a patient, he was professor in the arts, and the narcissistic personality disorder, and marital conflicts. And I asked him in the interview, which I ask routinely of all narcissistic personalities, have you had any other kind of difficulties with the police or with the law, and or activities that could, if discovered, could run you into problems with the police or with the law? And the patient said, "How do you know?" I said, "How do I know what?" He said, "I steal art books. I have an entire library of extraordinary art books, and I've never been caught. I look very respectful, and I know how to go and carefully select. And I think I have the right to do that, because this usual bourgeois with money who buy art books without any real art appreciation, it's a social waste. I'm going to use it for teaching and learning." That's a nice illustration. Antisocial behavior, yes, but not the aggression, not the paranoid orientation in a typical narcissistic personality. Next category, antisocial behavior in all other severe personality disorders, non-narcissistic. That has already better prognosis. The exception are infantile or histrionic personality disorders who show the Munchausen syndrome, who present pseudologia fantastica, imaginary illnesses that they produce, and or other histrionic infantile patients who chronically lie to an extent that makes a psychotherapeutic relationship almost impossible practically. But in general, the prognosis is better than when the structure is narcissistic. Next category, neurotic personality organization with antisocial behavior. These were the patients that Freud described as criminals out of unconscious guilt. There exists such a category. Very good prognosis. We had a physician in the hospital who was stealing magazines, sweets, and chocolates in the cafeteria of the hospital. A physician, I mean, totally crazy and self-destructive. Obsessive personality structure, excellent prognosis. I once treated a researcher in the biological sciences who falsified her results and got quite attention, and then she corrected her own experiences to undo the false results that she had published. I mean, totally absurd antisocial behavior without any usefulness of any kind. And behind that there was really unconscious guilt over her developing as a knowledgeable researcher in her field. Next category, antisocial behavior is part of adjustment reactions in adolescence. Very good prognosis. By the way, there are some symptoms that are practically normal, at least in the United States. Stealing cosmetic objects in department stores. Adolescent girls very often take lipstick and all kind of women's cosmetics, sometimes in groups, as if, with no other antisocial behavior, neither before nor after adolescence. Next category, the dissocial syndrome described by English authors. These are patients who are part of a social subgroup of a gang and carry out antisocial behavior as being part of the gang. You get them out of the gang and there is no more antisocial behavior. Next group, people who steal without any psychopathology simply because they are hungry and that's the only way in which they feel they can survive. It's a sociological problem, not a psychiatric. This list, as you can see, is very helpful because you can put your patient somewhere along and you immediately have the prognosis for that aspect of pathology. Final aspect of oh, I pressed the wrong button. Final symptom of the narcissistic personality disorder, a basic self-state of emptiness and boredom. These are patients who have a sense of meaninglessness of life and a stimulus hunger for things to keep them excited and interested. They are prone to addictions, sexual exploits, danger-seeking activities. They become the adventurers of foreign legions, explorers in dangerous sports, in the search for excitement that makes life worthwhile. And very often sexual seduction appears of sufficient exciting interest and gratification to justify living. If they have none of these, they feel empty, bored, and restless. And this is a consequence of the lack of an internal world of object relation, the fact that there's really a destruction of the internalization of significant representation of significant others. So the pathological grandiose self lives in an intrapsychic isolation, dependent on external admiration or exciting stimuli. Perhaps this is a point where we should make a pause.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay,